Okay, so I am going to demonstrate how to create just a simple plot using Matplotlib. I am using Google's platform that's similar to Jupyter, where it has cells and you can convert those cells into markup cells or code cells. So it's not too strange from Jupyter. So I'll be grabbing some data off the internet. So I have a URL with the CSV file. But before I start loading the data, let me import the libraries. I want to import pandas. So I will say import pandas as PD. And I also want to import Matplotlib as plt. So I'll choose that one. Remember, the alias for Matplotlib is plt. So always use that alias whenever you're going to import it. And whenever you use a function, you'll have to refer to plt first, followed by a period, and then the function. So these are the two that I'll be using right now. So I'll just run that. And I want to load the data. So to load the data, I have to use the pandas read_CSV function. So I have the URL already, so I'm going to just copy and paste this from the browser. And this is the URL. So if you take a look at the last part of this URL, it says tips.csv. So we're going to be grabbing some data related to tips, and we'll take a look at it. We'll inspect the data in a second. I will put this in a variable called tips, and that's going to be my data frame. And I'll say tips like this. Then I'll say pd.read underscore CSV. So I'm interested in that one. And I'll put the URL. Right? So I'm putting this here, which contains a string of that URL that I grabbed online. I want to do I'll go ahead and just print out a head method on the tips. See how it looks like. So here we have it. We have several data columns within this data frame called tips. We have information collected about a customer's bill, the tip that they pay to the waiter or waitress, and then if they're male and female, if they're smokers, and so on. So what I'm going to do is create a histogram, and this is a univariate type of analysis or visual that focuses on just one variable or one data column. And the data column that I'm going to focus on is the total bills. So I want to see what the distribution of that looks like. So let's go ahead and create that. Now, I'm just going to be using the hist function, so the plt.hist, and inside of it, and you can see here the different types of arguments that we can pass through. So we have to put x. X is going to be that variable that contains the data values, and then we can specify the bends. And since we are dealing with a histogram, we would want to make sure that we put the right number of bends. I think the defaults, if I'm not mistaken, might be 10, but we'll go ahead and put in the value 10, and we can add additional values just to see how it looks like. So let's go ahead and select the column of data within the tips data frame. So this is going to be that first column is what I'm going to put here for the X parameter. So since this is a data frame, one way I can put this in is by using the bracket notation. So I can say total bill, right? That's the variable name, but what I need to do here is put the data frame name and put total bill as a string inside square brackets. Right? And I'll go ahead and put bends, and I'll set that to 10. And I will run this cell to see what happens. All right, so here we have just a very simple histogram without any sort of X labels in terms of X-axis labels or Y-axis labels. That's something that we would have to add additional code to here in the cell, and we'll do that as well. So this is a histogram showing you the distribution of what customers are paying in terms of total bill. And we can say that this is a positive skew because you can see here, this is the peak, and it's kind of, the tail is kind of going down towards the right-hand side. So if we want to add some labels, for example, here, what we could do is say plt dot, I'll say X labels or X label. And inside this function, there are different things that we can put. I'm going to say as a string that this represents total bill. And I'm going to say Y label. And here I'll say something like frequency. Now we have a better presentation. I can add a title to this if wanted to by saying plt.title, leave right here, and I can say histogram of total bill. And this obviously has to be in string, so if I didn't, I'll get an error. Now we have a better looking plot, histogram, focusing just on one variable. This is univariate type of visual. And that's pretty much what you would do for a simple plot like this. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put in a plt.show. I don't have to, since this is going to be the only plot in this cell. But if you were to have other types of visuals within this cell, then you'd have to put a plot for every single visual that you would want to show. So just to kind of get used to things, get used to putting the plt.show, and I'm just going to add it here. Nothing's going to change again. But if I had like another histogram that I want to show within this cell, I'd have to put a plot.show so it can show both. So consider the plt.show like a print statement for a chart. So really quick to put things into context. So if I had another plot that I want to display inside here, I would have to have, and let's say, for example, we're going to put, instead of total bill, let's say tips. So let me just fix this here, changing the labels, and I'll fix that there. I believe the variable is called tip, the data column itself right here. And I will go ahead and run it. Now I have two histograms, one that's related to the total bill and the other one's related to tips. These are both in one cell, and I want to make sure that I have the plt.show at the end of each chunk of code related to that plot, so it could display both. Now, if I exclude this one and try to run it, well, you see what's happening here. It's being included in the same plot, and it doesn't necessarily mean that's wrong. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to do. But if I wanted them in two separate plots, I would have to make sure I have that plt.show displaying two different plots, right? So that's something that you definitely want to pay attention to when you're creating multiple plots. All right, so I want to demonstrate how to create subplots. Now, this is different from the previous example where I just went ahead and created the visual using plt.hist. I didn't have to define a figure object or an axis object. This is just one quick way of displaying the different types of charts that you might want to display. So now, to create a subplot, I'm going to use a more standard method that is often used in Python documentation, but there are many. And I only really talk about just a few in my lectures, but let me just demonstrate how to do one of the more common types of subplots. So you would want to create a figure object and an axis object. And I'm going to use the approach where you would define or you would create both the figure and the axis object at once. So I'll go ahead and say fig for the figure object, and then ax for the axis object, or I can just go ahead and say axes for axes. And I need to assign those objects the plt.subplots function. So this is how you would create the figure object as well as the axis object. I'm not going to use the word figure because the word figure is going to be reserved. So avoid using the actual word figure when it comes down to creating these things. When I run, I'm not going to run it just yet, and I want to add on to my code. But doing this is, you don't have to worry about using the plt.figure as I demonstrated in my lectures, and I'll do another demo on this here. But for now, let's focus on the creation of subplots. So now that I have my figure and axis object, I can go ahead and create my my subplot. So my first axis, let's go ahead and create a two. I want to do a 1 by 2, meaning one row, two columns. And you can see here in the help feature that these are the parameters that I could use in my set of parentheses here. I'm just only using the number of rows and the number of columns. And this takes keyword arguments. So I could say n rows equals 1 and n columns equals 2. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. Now, for my first subplot, and I talk about the term axes and subplots being used interchangeably, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a histogram. It's going to be similar to the histogram that I created in the previous example. And I want to do a histogram on tips, total bill. But you know what? This time I'm going to use the dot notation instead of the bracket notation. So I'll say this, and I want to have a bends of 10. So 10 bends. I'll run it. If I get an error, I'll correct it. Let's go ahead and see what happens here. All right, run it. This is what it looks like right now. I have a figure object, which is kind of like a canvas where it's plotting two different charts. Right now, I indicated on the first chart, it's going to be a histogram. The second chart, I haven't really put any information on that, and I'll go ahead and do that now. So inside bracket notation, I'll put 1. So this is referring to the index position of where this plot would be. So index position 0 is that first plot related to total bills. Index position 1 is going to be the tips. So I'll say hist, tips, tip, and I want to also have 10 bends inside here. And I'll run it. And I probably did a typo right here. Fix that. There we have it. So for practice, I'll go ahead and say plt.show. So you'll still want to do that at the end of every chunk of code that you're displaying some visual. I would want to also create some labels into this, into my subplots. So I'll do that in a minute, but hopefully you can tell the difference between these two, right? So these two are two different plots. And you can tell by their chunks of code here, where this is actually one plot, right? Or considered to be like one figure that contains two plots together, what we call subplots. And since I am using the axes approach, what you would do to create the title and the x-axis labels and any other sort of customizations, the syntax will be a little bit different from what I had up top. So let's say we want to customize the first subplot. So I'm going to just hit enter for right now, and I'm going to refer to that axis that I want to add, let's say the x-axis, right? And so there's the set underscore, I believe it is x, let's see, yeah, x labels, I believe, or x label, and then I will put in parentheses total bill, and then we have the set y label. Let me see what happens here. Yeah, set y label. You can go ahead and say frequency. I'm just going to run this to see if it works okay. It does. So you can see the labels appearing on their axis. All right, so I will have to do the same thing, but for the other subplot. So I can just copy this code and just make some modifications. And this is going to be the approach that you'd want to take just to save some time. Let me go ahead and add that right here. And I'm going to change the index location for both of them. And for the X label, we now have a tip, and I'll run this. So we'll see that there is a tips label here. And now we have a little bit of an issue when it comes down to the Y label. You see there's a little bit of an overlap between the two subplots. So there is a function for that. And so let's go ahead and add that function to try to correct it. So let's do that. If I'm not mistaken, I think it is plt.title layout. Let's see what happens when I run that. It doesn't correct it, so then I would have to kind of adjust the spacing some other way. So let me look into the documentation and correct it. Or actually what I could do is, since they're kind of a little too close together, I could change the figsize, and you might want to do this whenever you create subplots like this. So the figsize is a parameter within the subplots function that I have here in line 2. So I will say figsize equals, and it's going to take a tuple. So that's why I have the parentheses here. And let's say I wanted to do something like 10 by 8 size. Yeah, there you go. So then the frequency kind of adjusts there. You can play around with the width and the height to see what would be an appropriate type of figure size. And let's see, I like my 10 by 8. Fine. Okay. Ready? I'm just going to change that to 15 by 8, which looks like this. Okay, so what's different from the see if I can do this here. What's different from the previous example? So we didn't create any subplots. We just went ahead and created the histogram using the plt.hist function, and that was pretty much it. But for the second example, what we did is we had to create a figure object and an axis object, and then we have the equal sign operator, and then we assigned the plt.subplots function, and we put that into these objects. So we're using the multiple assignment operator. In my lecture, I talk about a different way of doing this, but this is just a shortcut where we could put this line into 2 lines and separate the assignments that way. But this is just, again, it will just save you a line of code to do. And I have the number of rows indicated and the number of columns. You have to make sure that when you're creating multiple subplots that you have to put an argument for rows and columns. If it's just one subplot that you're adding into this figure object and axis object, you don't have to worry about putting any sort of number here. And as a matter of fact, it will not accept a 1 by 1. So you'll just leave it blank. You could add additional parameters, and this is found under the Python documentation. If you were to type in plt.subplots documentation on an internet search, you'll get what you're looking for in terms of all the different parameters that you can choose from. And then I went ahead and started creating my subplots by referring to the axis object that I defined here. And I'm using the index position number 0. And I talk about the index position numbers and the location of different subplots in my lecture. And then I indicated I want to do a histogram, and then I put in the parameters there. And then I did it again, changed the index, and did it for a different variable. Okay, so adding on to the previous example where I created a 1 by 2 figure that contained 2 subplots, and this is how it looked like. I'm going to add an additional 2 axes to this figure and plot at least one more subplot within that figure and leave the other one empty, just to kind of give you an idea of what you would want to do when it comes down to creating several or at least a few subplots in one figure. So there's no need for me to have to rewrite this code. I'm going to go back to the previous example code and make some changes, but I'm going to paste it into another cell. So I'll go ahead and paste it into this cell here. Now, let me go ahead and just copy this code, paste it over here into this cell, and I will make some changes to the parameters here. So for subplots, you're going to keep this as is, the subplots function, and we're going to have a 2 by 2 instead of a 1 by 2. And I will let the figure size be the same, so I'll leave it as 15 by 8. And now my first plot, which is going to be in the top left portion of my axis, since I have a 2 by 2, meaning 2 rows by 2 columns, my index position numbers are going to change a little bit. I have to add a comma and then another 0 to represent that this histogram that we have here is going to be on the top left portion of my figure. And the rest of the code stays pretty much the same. I just have to include an extra 0 for the histogram that's going to contain total bills. And then for the histogram that's going to be on the top right portion is going to be it's going to be 0, 1, meaning the first row and the second column, right? These are index position numbers. Everything else here stays the same because I want to plot this in the figure. And I'm just going to make the change here. So I'll say 0, 1, 0, 1, and I can just press enter here. I'm going to create another subplot. And now that position is going to change. So it's going to be in the second row, first column. Second row, first column. Second row, first column. Right now, I don't want a histogram. What I'll do is a bivariate display of tips and bill to see what kind of relationship there is between the two. So instead of .hist, I'm going to use the .scatter method. And I want to delete this information because the .scatter method has its own set of parameters. So I need to indicate an X and a Y, and I will say that the tips, I'll say, see if I can do the dot notations. I'll say total bill, and that's going to be my X, and my Y is going to be tips, and I believe, yeah, tip is the column name. All right, so my X label is going to change. So if this is my X parameter and this is my argument that's going into the X parameter, I know that my X label is going to be total bill, and then the Y label will be tip. And I'm going to leave everything else as is. So this is all going to be within one figure. There should be 3 subplots out of the 4 shown. So let's go ahead and run this. And that's how it looks like. If I wanted to add an additional subplot into my 2x2 that I've defined here, then I would probably copy this code again and then change the axis index position numbers and put whatever type of visual that I want here. Right. So it just depends on what it is that you want to display. You could also do changes. There's many things that you can do in terms of formatting, customization. Let's say, for example, the histogram here, we want it to be a different color. So let's let the tips be the color green. So I'll say color equals green. I'll just put G for green, run it, and we have a different color for that. Right? There's a lot of things, again, that you can do. Look at the Matplotlib documentation that's related to the .hist. Before I conclude this video, let me just include a background on these visuals. Going to this code here, the very first thing I'll do is I'm going to put this code here. So we have plt.style.use, and this will give it a background format that's nice. It's called ggplot. It's a popular format style for data visualizations. So this is still using the matplotlib library, and then we're using the style.use technique. And I run this, my background changes to a gray grid type of view. So it might be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. It really depends on what kind of style that the audience is used to. So just be careful on what kind of background information or background argument that you would put in something like this. There's a whole bunch out there in the documentation that you'll just have to do an internet search on and see what would be suitable. Whenever you do use this plt style.use and put a certain background color, you'll need to use certain code to go back to its default setting if you're not liking that style that you're using and that you've selected. And this is the code that I found on the internet. So you'll just have to run this once. And once you run this once, you'll want to make sure that style is no longer going to run in the background. Run your code again, and then you go back to its original settings. Again, this is the code here, so you might want to keep it handy in case this is the route that you need to take.